express my appreciation for being able to speak from these benches again after a 2-year lapse and being able to take advantage of the very real privilege we have of being able to raise on adjournment matters that are very acutely of concern to our constituents. And I want to raise the issue of school funding, which proved to be an issue of massive importance during the election campaign, not just to me and my constituents, but to many others. Just to give examples of the kind of problems that have surfaced, I visited 3 primary schools in the last week. One of them has already, in order to balance its budget, had to seek a parental contribution of £120 a head from each parent. Another had to put a proposition to the parents to go on to part-time schooling for 1 day a week. They've subsequently withdrawn it in favour of a parental contribution and redundancies. And this is a pattern that is now being repeated throughout my borough and indeed many others.
Would the honourable gentleman give way?
Briefly will. Yeah.
I thank him for giving way, and I can indeed confirm that in the London Borough of Sutton we have exactly the same issues. I have had, I think, every secondary head write to me expressing concerns requiring, for instance, the schools to cut back on the A-level options that are available. Does he hope, as I do, that the Schools Minister will respond positively and set out how London can benefit from the bonanza that was available to the DUP in the last couple of weeks, so that we can see the right level of funding in our schools as well?
Well, he anticipates a point I was due to make. But he's absolutely right. This is a problem that is widely shared. But the elements which have contributed to this anxiety in the school sector are several, one of which is that we've had flat or falling funding in nominal terms per pupil certainly over the last couple of years. It's a small fall, but significant. But much more serious, there has been a very big increase in costs. Costs that were previously borne by central government are now being offloaded onto individual schools. Some of the more obvious ones being national insurance contributions, which have added a couple of percentage points to the payroll, and that's 80% of the cost of a typical school. The increase in pension contributions, and one particularly bizarre item, which is causing considerable puzzlement in the schools, is the apprenticeship levy. I can perhaps claim some authorship of the original ideas behind the apprenticeship levy from the coalition years, but none of us ever intended that it would apply to schools. I mean, the training of teachers and indeed other professionals does not go through an apprenticeship route. It appears to be the case that this is being introduced because maintained schools are regarded as council employees. Of course, the whole direction of government funding is to move in the opposite direction, and there is a completely bizarre distinction between academies and non-academies. Now, I just wonder whether the Schools Minister, in discussions with his colleagues, can lift what is not a massive but extremely irritating and at the margin onerous burden on schools. It's something that would help significantly and is clearly inappropriate. Now, the consequence of these changes, together with the new funding formula which the government has mooted, is very significant indeed. And the National Audit Office has estimated that between 2014-15 and 2019-20, which is when the funding formula comes in, there will have been an 8% real cut overall in English schools. The Education Policy Institute, which has done a parallel study, which is broadly actually in favour of the principle of the funding formula, notes that the cut is of something in the order of 6 to 11% in a narrower period, 16-17 to 19-20, with over half of primary and secondary schools facing cuts of that magnitude. Let me just take the discussion very specifically to the funding formula, which was the way in which I couched this debate. I have no objection to the principle of, I don't think anybody possibly could have, objection to the principle of trying to achieve fairness in the allocation of funds. perfectly desirable objective, not that there's ever likely to be much of a consensus, but striving to achieve better fairness in distribution is a perfectly acceptable philosophical principle. Nor am I coming here to make a particular whinge about my own Twickenham constituency and borough, because actually, as I think the figures net out, we're not particularly significant losers. Indeed, on self-calculations, there may be a small gain, unlike in many parts of inner London, which will be hit very severely. But there are nonetheless some very serious problems with the funding formula as it is due to be applied, and I just wanted to raise these with the Minister in the hope that he can give us some confidence that they will be addressed. I think the first is that it's clearly much easier to introduce a new funding formula when budgets overall are flat or rising than when they're falling. It's a simple matter of common sense. We have some schools in my constituency, secondary schools, for example, that face 3% real cuts in order to meet the funding formula. If this were done at a time when their budget was flat and others were rising, one can see how they can accommodate it. But imposing on already very stressed financial budgets real cuts as a consequence of the formula is just making this deeply, deeply unattractive. I think it has been estimated that if the government were able to bring in the funding formula while ensuring that no school actually loses in absolute terms, it would probably cost them 335 million. I think that's the informed estimate that's been made. And that sounds a lot of money, but as my colleague from Carshalton has pointed out, in relation to some of the other transactions of the last 48 hours, it probably isn't all that significant. And I just wondered if the Minister could clarify a commitment which I think was made in his party's manifesto, that they would ensure that no school was absolutely worse off as a result of the formula. That would certainly help lubricate the whole process. My second concern is a different one, and it's nothing to do with money, but it's about the centralisation of decision-making that is a consequence upon this new formula. At present, there is a significant degree of flexibility for local authorities in moving money within the funding blocks, particularly within the school block. And this enables local authorities to take account of local circumstances. In my particular case, we have a significant number of problems in the secondary sector, significant number of out-of-borough pupils, the fact that we have a large number of pupils who go into the private sector at 11 or thereabouts, and more challenging demands on the secondary sector. So there is an understanding locally that there should be effectively a cross-subsidy from primary to secondary. That's local circumstances and people understand it and agree with it. Under the funding formula, that kind of local particular concerns can no longer be taken into account. And one of the practical consequences in my particular area is that the secondary schools, which have particular needs, will be very savagely hit because these cuts will fall on them disproportionately. And as I understand it, there is going to be very little capacity in the DFE or with regional commissioners to be able to handle the kind of local negotiation that would be required to take account of these particularities. So can I ask the Minister if he can try to ensure that as we move to a new funding system, it doesn't become hopelessly over-centralised. I mean, there's a real danger here that we have a Soviet style of financial allocation that takes no account of local circumstances. My third concern is with special needs and disadvantaged pupils who fall within the SEN block. As he will know, this at present is a complete mess in terms of funding at local level. Local authorities are not funded remotely up to the level which is required to meet the special needs of statemented pupils. The new plan system, which was passed in the last Parliament, requires substantial funding that is simply not available. Local schools are having to use out-of-borough private providers of special needs education, which is often very high cost. Indeed, I think one of the things the government should think about is a Competition and Markets Authority referral for some of these institutions. But whatever the reasons, Local councils have run up very, very large deficits on their special needs budgets. They're having to use school block money in order to support it. Many schools are in great difficulty as a result of the financing of special needs, so much so that schools that were regarded as centres of excellence are now having to try to deter people coming because of the extra cost involved. And you're getting a kind of pass-the-parcel system developing with special needs, which is deeply unhealthy and completely inimical to good schooling. I think a fourth concern I have about the proposals as they currently stand are all kind of perverse incentives that are built into the rather complex formula that the department has evolved. One of which is that it penalises high achievement. I mean, I happen to represent a borough where 50% of pupils at schools are regarded as outstanding and the other 50% are good. It's a very high achievement area. Parents have very high expectations. Schools deliver. Now, under the formula, high achievement will be penalised. And the funding is being redirected to schools in which there is low achievement. One of the utterly perverse consequences is that schools in London, particularly inner London, areas like Hackney and Lewisham, Lambeth, which 20 or 30 years ago were regarded as dreadful sink schools, are now very high achieving schools in terms of value added, and these schools are going to lose significant amounts of funding.
I think he's making a very good point, because certainly in Wokingham, which has very low per pupil amounts and has good performing schools, we feel there is a problem. And wasn't the idea of the reform to have a higher absolute amount for every pupil in the country, because there is a basic cost wherever you're being educated?
Yes, indeed, and I think the Right Honourable Member makes a very important point, that it isn't a question of just having a sort of basic amount of funding, but we need to have an evidence base about what the cost of running a school actually is. And what I do worry about the formula as it's currently devised is there is no evidence base. Wild guesses have been made about the differential costs of secondary and primary school, and we do need to have objective studies of what it costs to run a school so that this formula can work perfectly well. Perhaps I just want to round up and come to conclusion to give the Minister a plentiful opportunity to reply. But I think my final point is this, that in addition to all the other difficulties I've mentioned, there is a high level of uncertainty about how this new formula is going to apply. Some of our secondary schools, which will face deep cuts, are protected up to a point by the maximum 3% cut, the floor that's been introduced, but we don't know for how many years that's going to continue. If they take painful corrective measures now, will they have to continue to do it? There is uncertainty about how the growth of pupil numbers is going to be accommodated. I think a system of retrospective prompt rebating could easily be done, would make life much easier for the planning of school finances. But just to round off my comments, Mr. Speaker, I think there is an acceptance on both sides of the House that funding distribution needs to be looked at in a fair framework. It cannot happen in an environment that currently exists of large-scale cuts across the board. And I sincerely hope also the Minister will look at some of the other points I've mentioned about the need for much more decentralisation and flexibility of decision-making. This would make it much easier to carry through this reform. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.